Welcome to the 60th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. In this six-part lecture series, entitled The 12 Caesars, Images of Power from Ancient Rome to Salvador Dali, Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University examines the continuing engagement throughout history with images of Roman emperors and its impact on Western visual art and culture. In this fourth lecture, entitled Caesar's Wife, Above Suspicion, originally delivered at the National Gallery of Art on April 17, 2011, the esteemed classicist and professor Mary Beard discusses the role of female members of the imperial court in terms of dynastic succession, the transmission of power, and their representation in antique and post-antique art.
Hello everybody, it's great to see you, and because if I leave this to the end I will forget to say it, I'm going to say now that it's our spring break next week. So there won't be a lecture next week, but we'll be picking up again the following week when we go to look at some fantastic treasures of silverware and Titian, and there'll be one more lecture after that when the fate of Andrew Jackson's sarcophagus will be finally revealed to you. But at last, this week, hooray, we are going to get to some women. That's to say, the lecture is going to focus on the female members of the imperial court, both in the Roman world and as they have been represented right up to our day, sometimes actually rather magnificently, and sometimes, as you might predict, horribly misogynistically. We're going to be looking at women like this, cast as loyal wives and virtuous mothers, but also, if I can get the... Now, Jeannie told me that once it had stopped in rehearsal, it would never stop when we did it in real life. This reminds you of the old days, doesn't it, when the slides would get stuck and you'd have to get a knife. But this is... but a knife isn't going to mend this fire.
No. Let's try it here.
Yeah.
All right. I'll go up there. Fill in.
I will fill in, right? This is what we used to be very good at this. We used to have all sorts of text ready to fill in when somebody got a new bulb for the slide projector. I should just go on pushing for every now and then to see if it changes. This is like the old days. We're going to be looking at those loyal wives. We're going to be looking at women who are decried as adulteresses or alternatively half admired for their sexual stamina. Here's two versions of Messalina, the third wife of the Emperor Claudius, by Aubrey Beardsley, who's reflecting the ancient story, which is part satire, part rumour, and part fantasy, that Messalina had a part-time employment in a brothel. And we'll be looking at women who are accused of all kinds of inappropriate ambition. Here's Agrippina, who's the third wife of Claudius and mother of the Emperor Nero, sharing a coin with her son. Nero and Agrippina, very nose to nose. Many modern scholars looking at this have thought that the apparent equality of this pair of heads was a sign that Agrippina was certainly pushing her luck in the imperial power struggles. And here's a different image of Messalina. And where she is here. All right? Now, what this is, it's on a bit of 16th century silverware, and the artist has captured the story that Suetonius tells of Messalina, that she was so keen on sharing her husband's triumphal procession with him that she had a special covered wagon made, and which she drove in. There's the emperor in his triumphal chariot going off this way, and there's Messalina following in her covered wagon. And here is the wonderful Sian Phillips, who I think everybody over 50 will remember. starring as the Emperor Augustus's wife, Livia, in the BBC HBO 1970s adaptation of I, Claudius. In Graves's version of imperial history, Livia pretty well poisoned her way to the top. And that wasn't very different from what many ancient writers themselves alleged about her. The message was, if Livia offers you a fig, don't touch it, I think. Now, we will be looking at a whole variety of women, colourful, malevolent, long-suffering, whatever, almost all of them seen through the eyes of men, recreated in marble, glass, and on paper by men. We're not going to get any chance, really, to see these women from their own point of view. Barely a word that any of them wrote still survives. And they did actually write things. Agrippina, who we've just seen on the coin, in fact, wrote her own memoirs, but it's significant that they're lost. I think classicists often get asked a kind of parlour game of, which lost work of classical literature would you most like to have? And all the boys always say, the lost works of Livy and things like this, Livy on the late Republic. And I always say the memoirs of Agrippina is what we would want. Nor, I'm afraid, are we going to find many feminist icons here, not even retrospectively created ones. In fact, if you were to visit Judy Chicago's dinner party, that famous 1970s installation with its pantheon of iconic historical women, it's now on the screen, the nearest you'd find to a Roman imperial woman at the place settings round the table is Boadicea. There she is. No Messalina, no Agrippina, no Livia, but instead the rebel British queen who led the massacre of several Roman legions in the reign of Nero and burnt down London before coming to a very nasty end herself. Now here you see Boadicea in what is to me a much more familiar form in a 19th century statue in London, where the woman written up by Romans as a dastardly terrorist has been turned into the founding mother of the British Empire. On the plinth is inscribed the jingoistic slogan, "Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway." That is, you are going to command more territory than the Romans ever did, O Britons, which always seems to me a kind of nice indication of the way that time, place, and perspective makes a very big difference to where you see power and virtue lying. Suetonius would have been utterly horrified to think that the British Empire had put up a statue of this rebel. Those words, "Region Caesar never knew," actually come from a poem by Cooper, 18th century poem in praise of the Queen, and that's what you've got on one side of your handout. But if we don't find many feminist icons, which we don't, we shall find some intriguing surprises and some unexpected significance in images of women in the imperial court. And there are some shocks in store. This rather nasty medieval image of the dissection of one imperial lady is one I'm afraid we are going to have to come back to. And there are some controversies too. We'll be looking, for example, at the perils of representing modern women in the guise of Roman empresses. In particular, Canova's statue of Napoleon's mother in the guise of Agrippina here, which was a very controversial image indeed. And I'm going to be unearthing some wonderful cases of mistaken identity. And at the end, I shall be homing in on this wonderful couple from the National Gallery here and wondering who exactly they might be. Now, I must apologise to someone who I said to last week that I would be talking about images of George Washington to this afternoon. I won't be. I thought I didn't want to kind of ease the women out by ending with Washington. And anyway, Washington, I think, belongs more comfortably along with Andrew Jackson and the sarcophagus in the last lecture. So we will be returning to Washington, but not today. But let's start with some basics about the role of women in the imperial dynasty in general. Now, the truth is there is a large and complicated cast of female characters. And in order to make this a bit more manageable, the multicolour is brilliant, isn't it? In order to make it a bit more manageable, I think it's this coloured slide that keeps making the thing stick. It's a bit too much for the PowerPoint. I'm going to be concentrating mainly on the Julio-Claudian period, that is between Julius Caesar and Nero, and I've given you on this slide just a glimpse of some of the women involved. We've got multicoloured emperors, colour-coded with their wives. So you'll see there's plenty more wives than there are emperors. The ones that I'm going to be talking most about, Livia and Messalina and Agrippina, I've underlined there. Now, formally, and this is the first point I want to emphasise, none of these women, none of them, were in any official sense empresses. Right? Now, I know a few minutes ago I used that word when I talked about representing modern women in the guise of Roman empresses, and we all knew what I meant. But at Rome, there was no such even semi-official position as empresses. What we're dealing with is a loose group of the emperor's wives and mothers and daughters and sisters and cousins and lovers. They had various degrees of influence and power, but they didn't sit next to the emperor on the throne. And there's just a little prequel of them. So that's the first point. There's no such thing as an empress, even if sometimes I use the word. The second point is that Roman writers treat these female members of the imperial family, which is the long periphrasis you have to use if you don't say empresses, they treat these female members of the imperial family as more powerful than the elite women had been in that earlier period of the Free Republic. In fact, the existence of powerful women at Rome, and for Romans, powerful women always meant over-powerful women. There's no such thing as a good powerful woman. Powerful women are seen as a feature that distinguishes the imperial period from the earlier republic. Now, I'm pretty confident that in reality, their power was nothing like what is written up to be. And I think if Livia, for example, knew all the things that she was supposed to have got up to and all the inconvenient rivals she was supposed to have eliminated, I think she'd be absolutely amazed. But the image is one of power, and that's very important. And I think there are two reasons for that image being generated, both of which go back really to the very structure of one-man rule. First, in any court culture like the Roman one, power is always perceived to lie with those who are close to the guy at the top. It's really the power of proximity. The people who are thought to wield influence are those who have the ear of the emperor, whether that's because they shave his beard or, better still, because they share his bed. And up to a point, of course, there is power in proximity. And that's what drives the old cliche about women being the power behind the throne. But more than that, and this is where I think the exaggeration of women's influence really takes off, both in ancient and modern writing on Rome, women are a wonderfully convenient explanatory device for the mysteries, inconsistencies, and vagaries of the emperor's decision-making and policy. But no one, absolutely no one on the outside of the palace walls ever knew for certain how decisions were made inside the palace or by whom. And that's something that historians in ancient Rome itself are always complaining about. But blaming the influence of the wife was a convenient catch-all explanation. He did it to please Livia or Messalina or Agrippina or whoever. And that's, of course, what Robert Graves' I, Claudius trades on, and what the modern media also trade on when they blame, say, Cherie Blair for things that Tony actually did. And I remember Nancy Reagan, I think, was always getting blamed for what, round the cocoa in the evening, she was always putting ideas into Ron's head, I think. So our papers used to say. So They're a kind of useful explanatory device for explaining the bafflement of imperial power and decision-making. And second, of course, and this goes back to the theme of last week, second is the key role that women play in the strategies of dynastic succession. To put it at its simplest, any hereditary dynasty needs women in order to produce heirs. And it's this crucial dynastic role that underlies the two dramatically different antitypes that ancient writers appeal to when they describe imperial women. On the one hand, there are those that act correctly within the dynasty, who bear children loyally and operate to facilitate the proper and orderly progression and transmission of power. On the other hand, are those whose behaviour threatens to disrupt dynastic succession, whether they do that through adultery or incest, or through a disruptive partiality for their own children within the pattern of succession, and the elimination of rivals that follows from that. Poisoning, I have to say, being the method that is usually alleged, which was the traditional female crime in the Roman world, as it has been later. It's secret and stealthy, and domestic. And poisoning is really a kind of perverted form of cookery, which is why women get blamed to it. Now, as this slide of Messalina, the imperial harlot, reminds us, those different types, loyal mother and whore, are often projected onto exactly the same women. Now, the bottom line of that is then that the accusation of gross sexual immorality that is very often thrown at many imperial women may reflect what they got up to, it may do, but it much more likely doesn't. It's much more likely an ideological construction, because the ideological pressure point in the Roman imperial dynasty, like in other similar patriarchal systems, the ideological pressure point is the sexual containability and regulation of those women whose job it is to bear legitimate heirs. Can the emperor know and be as certain as possible that his children are really his? That's always the question. And it's a pressure point in the Julio-Claudian dynasty made all the more charged, I think, by the fact that no natural son of any emperor did actually ever manage to succeed his father for more than a century of imperial rule. Vespasian, remember I said, was the first emperor who undoubtedly died a natural death in 79 AD. He was also the first emperor to have his natural son succeed him. Now, it's this anxiety about the danger of women in the dynasty that underlies the half quotation in the title of this lecture, Above Suspicion. In the full form, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. This slogan actually comes from a story about Julius Caesar that goes back to a time before he was sole ruler in Rome, when he was still an ambitious young politician. His then wife Pompeia, who you see here on the screen, was conducting an all-female religious ritual when a man was reported to have got inside in the house where they were doing it. The rumours were that this was a lover's prank and that the man was actually having an affair with Pompeia. Caesar claimed he himself did not suspect her of this, but he divorced her nonetheless because he said Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. So you can see that that's playing on just the kind of issues that I've been mentioning. And you see similar anxieties or their insistent denial running right through the ancient accounts of the dynasty and its female members. And that's sometimes in the conflicting stories told about the same individual. Take Livia's role in or at the death of her husband Augustus. One tradition says that she murdered him to get her natural son Tiberius onto the throne. It was quite difficult to do because Augustus obviously had all his food tasted. So she had to smear the poison directly onto the figs as they grew on the trees, which he then picked, and he never thought to have them tasted, because you wouldn't have a fig tasted if you actually picked it yourself. Little did he know. Compare that with the description in Suetonius. So there's no mention of poisoning at all, in fact, quite the reverse. There, Augustus's death scene becomes an almost parodically conjugal affair. He dies, apparently, while kissing Livia. He actually dies while he's kissing Livia. And he is simultaneously saying, it's not clear how he could do this, he's simultaneously saying, "Live mindful of our marriage, Livia, farewell." Now, we can't possibly know what really happened at Augustus's deathbed, and neither, I think, could Suetonius know or the other ancient writers. But those different versions of the scene, either a long-last kiss or she's been adulterating the figs, those different versions of the scene nicely sum up the dilemmas and the contradictions in the representations of imperial women. But you also find women compared and contrasted around those types. And the two Agrippinas, mother and daughter, are one such duo, and they're going to be my key example today. So in an extremely, extremely simplified way, I have diagrammed for you their place in the dynasty. There's Agrippina the elder, the mum, and there's Agrippina the daughter. What this does is highlight exactly why these two women were so key in the strategies of dynastic succession, because they both go back directly in a natural line to Augustus, not through his marriage to Livia, which was childless, but to his marriage to his first wife, Scribonia. They are direct descendants of the Emperor Augustus. So they're terribly important in the thought of heirs. They're also absolutely chalk and cheese. Mother is good, daughter is bad. Or so the standard narrative would suggest. We haven't the foggiest clue, I have to say, what they were really like. Now, Agrippina the elder was married to a dashing young prince, Germanicus, who is the nephew of the bad-tempered emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died abroad in suspicious circumstances, and fingers always pointed at Tiberius, who was said to be extremely jealous of this charismatic young rival, when Germanicus died abroad, Agrippina loyally brought his ashes back to Rome and reared the children that she had had by him, until eventually she was forced into exile by Tiberius, at which point she bravely starved herself to death. Now, it's true that some ancient writers thought that her high principles bordered on intransigence. It might just have been a better idea to make a deal with Tiberius. But certainly she was high principle. She's the one side, the good side. Agrippina the younger, so the stories went, was the mirror image. For a start, she is reported to have had an incestuous relationship both with her brother, who became the Emperor Caligula, and later with her son, the Emperor Nero. She had two marriages, first to Nero's father and the second to the Emperor Claudius, after he'd finally disposed of Messalina. She is then supposed to have killed Claudius in 54 AD with the old poisoned mushroom trick, and wangled her Nero onto the throne in preference to Claudius's own son by Messalina. But after a brief honeymoon period, when they appear together on the coins, as we saw, Nero soon tired of her and had her disposed of. The story is that after her death, Nero inspected the corpse of his mother over a glass of wine, praising some aspects of her body, but criticising others. Now, heaven knows whether any of that is literally true. Maybe some is, maybe none is, almost none. But true or not, the death of Agrippina became a fantastic set piece in Roman imperial literature. It was a kind of mythic text of Roman autocracy and its corruption, a corruption that ends in matricide and incest. And the second passage on the paper you had on the other side of the Boadicea poem is Suetonius's colourful account of precisely that, the death of Agrippina, complete with all sorts of theatrical details, like a collapsible boat, which was Nero's first ingenious attempt at getting rid of Agrippina. She was going to be in the bay and the boat was suddenly going to collapse, but he'd not banked on the fact that she could swim, right? Other writers tell a broadly similar story to what Suetonius says, though they sometimes add or more likely invent extra details. One account, for example, says that when the assassins finally got to her, after she'd swum to the shore and gone back home, when they finally got to her, she bared her belly and told them to strike at her womb, thus turning even the moment of her death into a symbol of women's centrality in dynastic succession. So, these Agrippinas have the same name, but totally different roles to play in the story of the dynasty, and as we'll soon see, later art too. But what about ancient images of imperial women, and I mean imperial women in general, not just the Agrippinas? How do they get represented in marble, bronze, cameo, jewels, and so forth? And is there a different pattern from the representation of men that we've been concentrating on so far? Does female representation bring different aspects of power and its images into focus? Well, the truth is that not everything is different. It's not going to surprise you that many of the same problems of precise identification are found with the women too. In fact, it's probably even harder to put an exact name on apparently imperial women than on apparently imperial men. It's partly that there are fewer images of them. There's still a lot, but they're fewer. There are also far fewer coin images that you can match them up to. And frankly, the women end up looking even more alike than the men do. Now, sure, I haven't been able to resist showing you some sculptures so far to illustrate, in inverted commas, the people I've been talking about, the women I've been talking about. And I've tried to play up the differences, like giving you a nice basalt statue of Agrippina the Younger. But you certainly shouldn't imagine that the conventional identifications, which I've been putting in inverted commas, are correct. Nor, even if they were correct, should you imagine that the ladies concerned actually looked like that. And that's very much the same story as we've seen for the men. But there are two features that are significantly different with the women. First, if we turn particularly to cameos and gems, this isn't just true of cameos and gems, but particularly, they repeatedly represent women in their role as the transmitters of imperial power, looking backwards to the earlier phases of the dynasty and forwards to the children who would guarantee its future. Here is a cameo in which the figure of possibly Livia is seen as a guardian of the bust of her deceased husband. Now, the particular form of the crown he wears is almost certainly an indication that he's dead. And this little turquoise from the MFA in Boston probably is a similar scene. It's not clear who the male figure is. Some people think it's Augusta, some people think it's Tiberius, other people think it's her dead son Drusus, but whoever it is, I think the logic is the same. Likewise, this one again, with similarly dead Augustus here, probably, and possibly Livia, and the continuance of the dynasty represented at the top. Perhaps even more striking, though, is this cameo, which is often identified as Messalina, the wife of Claudius, with her children. It's actually even more extraordinary than it looks, because she's flanked here by a cornucopia, the horn of plenty that you often find in classical art as a symbol of fertility, plenty, and richness. It's usually represented as it is here, brimming with fruit. There's some grapes here, and then there's apples and lovely things coming out the top. Messalina's horn of plenty has got the grapes, but popping out of it, it's not the fruit, it's the little boy, right? Again, equating that notion of the fertility of the land with the fertility of the woman in dynastic succession. If that is Messalina, and if that is then her son Britannicus, although he's looking quite untroubled there, he had a nasty future in store. He was dropped down dead very suddenly at dinner in the early reign of Nero. Everybody thought it might have been an accident until they discovered that the funeral pyre had already been built. Now, tiny and uncertainly identified as they are, these images are important in the representation of succession. Last week I was stressing the role of the similarity of male imperial portraits in that process, the way that a homogeneous style of portraiture helped to make the heir look the part. Here we see that process of the transmission of power between the generations more actively represented. These images, I think, are doing more than simply representing these women as mothers. They're making the process of hereditary succession explicit. But there's another key difference between male and female imperial portraits. That's to say, in full-length portraits at least, these women are often very hard to distinguish from goddesses. Now, that was occasionally the case with emperors. I showed you this Emperor Claudius a couple of weeks ago, standing there with the eagle, which is the symbol of Jupiter. But by and large, Roman emperors tend to appear in portrait sculpture in iconically human roles, as general, as priest, whatever. The women, by contrast, are repeatedly presented in the guise of goddesses. Or to be more precise, we find statues that very obviously fit into the tradition of ancient divine images with divine attributes, like Claudius's eagle here, but with facial features that are strongly associated with the women of the first dynasty. Even that statue of Messalina that I showed you with her baby, if it is her, is actually a clear reference back to an earlier Greek statue of the goddess Peace holding her baby, the young god Wealth. And here on the screen now are a couple of statues that we may want to identify as the goddess Ceres, more cornucopias, as you can see, or we may want to identify as Livia herself. Now, Ceres, by the way, is the goddess of crops and fertility. Now, my view is here that we should be a bit more surprised by these statues than most archaeologists are. If you go to books or to museum labels, you usually find them labelled simply Livia as Ceres, Livia as Vesta, Livia as Juno. But it seems to me that those labels or that phrase conceals as much as it reveals. The problem obviously is, what does as mean, right? And what does it say about how the people actually saw those statues? Does it mean that we see Livia here in the clothes of Ceres? Is Livia dressed up as Ceres? Here's this fancy dress. I think sometimes it might be, actually. Or does it mean that it's Livia imagined as if she were a divine figure? Is it a kind of elegant visual metaphor of imperial power? Or is it making a claim that Livia, more or less, is a goddess? Or should we be thinking the other way round? Are we seeing a goddess who's been given some of the features of Livia? Is it not Livia as Ceres, but Ceres as Livia? Right? Now, there are huge issues and dilemmas here, and they point, I'm afraid, to one of the most murky areas of all Roman history, namely the relationship between imperial power and divine power. Or to put that in its most straightforward, within the structures of ancient pagan religion, what was the difference between an emperor and a god? Now, you'd be pleased to know I'm not going to answer that question, because we'd be here for a very long time. But also, in a rather narrower sense, these sculptures again raise problematic issues of identification. But this time, not between one member of the imperial house and another, but between imperial figures on the one hand and Olympian deities on the other. And a very great deal can hang on that, as this piece of sculpture now on the screen will help to show. It was excavated about 30 years ago at the Roman city of Aphrodisias in modern Turkey, which is a place that has produced probably the richest collection of Roman sculpture to be discovered in the 20th century. That collection includes an impressive number of imperial images, often in relief sculpture like this one, which originally appeared to have decorated a building put up in the 1st century AD at the time of the First Imperial Dynasty, a building that was devoted to some form of worship of the Roman emperor in some form of divine sense. Now, some of these images, not all, as you won't be surprised, some of these images are reasonably clear to identify, including this memorably brutal image, which is almost certainly Claudius in the act of conquering the province of Britannia. It's hard when you see this not to be reminded of Boadicea's complaints about the Romans, that the Romans had raped Britain. Well, I think that is roughly what's going on here. But this one, too, the one we've just seen, also has a fairly clear subject. It is almost certainly Nero, the Emperor Nero, being crowned. The problem is, who's he being crowned by? Now, the facial features suggest his mother, Agrippina. But the overall pose and her attributes are divine, and she looks with her cornucopia like the goddess Ceres again. So the standard answer is Nero is being crowned by Agrippina as Ceres. But again, that's not hugely helpful. Remember what I said a few minutes ago about the alleged role of Agrippina in the succession of Nero, edging him as her natural son onto the throne ahead of Claudius's son by Messalina. Could it really be the case that the dynamics of succession are here so frankly, so shamelessly exposed that we have in this statue Agrippina in divine costume crowning her son as emperor? Because if we have, that's a very big claim about female power. Or was this figure more conventionally read as a goddess conferring imperial power on the new emperor, albeit a goddess with a strikingly Julio-Claudian face? The answer is, we don't know, but I think there's a bigger issue here than is usually recognised. And we've been enjoying, I think, or hope we've been enjoying, the puzzles of identification throughout this series of lectures, and it does seem to me that these imperial women open up a new dimension to those puzzles, and one that can make a big difference to how we understand the dynamics of imperial power, who's in charge, who's conferring power, how do the divine and human spheres interrelate. But for the last 20 minutes of this lecture, I want to move on, as I have in earlier lectures, to thinking about how these women that we've been looking at in the imperial family and how some of the issues and problems associated with them have been represented and recreated in post-antique images. And I'm focusing on what seemed to me to be the richest pair in that respect, that is, the Agrippinas. Now, it will probably not come as a surprise that the artists, male artists in particular, of later centuries very much enjoyed exploiting these two antitypes of womanhood. The elder Agrippina, as you see her again here, was a perfect symbol for the 18th and 19th century, with that brilliant combination of ultimate and utterly unswayable wifely loyalty, combined with vociferous opposition to tyranny in the shape of Tiberius. Now, I think that really takes you to the heart of the sort of the prejudices of most male radicals in the 18th and 19th century. They wanted women to be opposed to tyranny, but they also wanted them to be very loyal to their husbands. And Agrippina fitted the bill perfectly. Now, we saw this Benjamin West's picture of Agrippina and her kids embracing the ashes of her husband here. West also conjured up this famous image of Agrippina returning to Rome, carrying the ashes of Germanicus. And West was just one of very many who had a go at this scene. In fact, 19th century sculptors positively sprayed statues of Agrippina around France. Here's just 3 that you can find in public places in France. This one in the Tuileries is in the centre, is one of 2 statues in those gardens of Agrippina. She's everywhere. But Agrippina the younger, and if anything, and particularly her relationship with her son Nero and the incest between her and Nero, and finally her murder by Nero, was, if anything, an even more popular theme. The display of the dead body of his mother to the murderous son prompted an array of voyeuristic images like these. There were also all kinds of visual meditations on different phases of the narrative of the murder. Here you see Nero kind of temporarily breaking off from the dinner party to order Mum's execution. And there were attempts also to take a glimpse into the psychopathology of the emperor. Here is Nero regretting what he has done, afterwards. But these artists of the 17th century and onwards weren't actually the first to rediscover the story of the Agrippinas. Both of these women had had a considerable appeal to artists and writers in the Middle Ages too, in some similar ways, and in some ways that are strikingly different. Here we have Agrippina the Elder being force-fed by the Emperor Tiberius, who is trying to prevent her starving herself. So here's Agrippina having a spoon pushed down her throat, and there she is, because Tiberius wants to stop her starving herself to death, and so becoming a martyr to his tyranny. And this very nasty image that we passed over quite quickly at the beginning of this lecture is none other than Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero. Here, she is being dissected after her death. We think and hope afterwards. I have to say there is a bit of a debate about whether this was vivisection or not. And there are plenty more on the same kind of theme. There's some slightly less lurid woodcuts, which I thought we'd have, and another bit of miniature dissection going on here. So what on earth is this all about? Well, these are illustrations of a once popular story, apparently invented in the Middle Ages, that tells not only how Nero had his mother murdered, but how, in a macabre sequel, he had her dissected after her death. He not only viewed and appraised the body, as Suetonius has, with a glass of wine. You may be able to see that this Nero here, although he's looking at dissection, he's got a glass of wine. He actually had her cut open. It's a story that's given full billing in the late 13th century version of the Roman de la Rose, for example. It's inserted into the French translation of Boccaccio's biographies of famous men. It's referred to in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and also in the great medieval theatrical box office hit, The Vengeance of Jesus Christ, which also refers to what Nero did. So what on earth is it all about? Well, at first sight, it may just look like a lurid medieval tale designed to add just a bit more blood and guts to an already bloody story of the Roman Empire. We certainly did that, but on closer reading, it turns out, I think, to be a rather more significant story and image. And one of the things it's doing is exploiting and representing the very issues of succession and women's role in the transmission of power that I've been emphasising, even if in a rather gory way. You'll remember that when I was discussing Roman versions of the murder of Agrippina, I referred to one extra detail that was not in Suetonius, that when she was killed, Agrippina bared her belly, pointed to her womb, and said, "Strike me there." Well, that is really also the nub of this medieval story too. Because Nero is not here merely engaged in some sort of form of simple sadism, nor is he engaged in a kind of proto-scientific experiment which just happens to be using his mum as the dead body concerned. What he's wanting to find is Agrippina's womb. As Chaucer put it in the Canterbury Tales, he had her womb slit to behold where he conceived was. And that's the crucial detail which is repeated in every other version of this story that I've read. Now, it hints, obviously, at the incestuous relationship between Nero and his mum, but more than that, it turns this also into a story about displaying, about making explicit, and of course, in a horrible metaphor, dissecting, the woman's role in making and conceiving emperors. Now, that interpretation of it is actually backed up by what happens next in some versions of the tale, for which I don't have any illustrations. For what Nero then insists, he's gone through this performance, Nero then insists that the doctors who've been dissecting his mother make him pregnant. Now, the doctors know that this is impossible. So they give him a potion in which a tiny frog is concealed, which then grows in Nero's stomach, becoming, as it gets bigger, so painful that he has to give birth to it by vomiting. He is then desolated, of course, to find that after all that pain and effort, all he has produced is a messy, bloody frog. The doctors blame him and they say, look, you didn't go the full 9 months, so it's your fault. The message, however, is clear. It's not just that men cannot bear children, but that emperors cannot on their own transmit the power they wield. Now, I'm afraid at this point, I cannot resist showing you a faint reflection of that sort of story of Agrippina, but one conjured up in 1999. In chasing down modern Agrippinas, I came across this painting by a New York artist called Julie Heffernan, and I saw that it was entitled Self-Portrait as Agrippina. So never one to trust an as and think, what did that mean? I emailed her and asked her to explain a bit about Agrippina. She confirmed, as I'd suspected, that this was not Agrippina the elder that was represented, but it was Agrippina the younger, Nero's mother, that she had in mind. She also pointed out to me that it's very hard to see, it's a very murky slide. There's lots of little rats around here, so all is not well, she said, in this. But Agrippina here, Heffernan cum Agrippina, is in the act, she explained, of pouring too much water into the glass, which is spilling over. The glass, she said, stands for the womb of Agrippina, which is very, very fragile. It's like glass. Now, I have no idea what Geoffrey Chaucer and his medieval friends would have made of this picture, but I think in a funny way they might have recognised some of the themes about fertility, fecundity, and what you might find inside Agrippina if you opened her up. Now, so far I've done my best to keep this pair of Agrippinas clearly distinguished, not to confuse my elder with my younger. All the same, I expect there will have been moments when you will have thought, as I've been going on, hang on a minute, which Agrippina is she talking about? And in a way, I hope you have thought that. Because, as you might have guessed, part of the modern history of this pair is precisely that they have been frequently muddled up. Or rather, whenever you talk about Agrippina, there's always the question of which Agrippina are you talking about? And I want to end the lecture now by looking at how those issues of identification can be actually particularly intriguing. And I'm going to be moving from this statue, named Agrippina, on the Capitoline at Rome, through a brief look at Canova's statue of Napoleon's mum as Agrippina, to the Rubens that I showed you at the beginning in this gallery. Now, on display in the Capitoline Museum since the 17th century, this seated female figure is now thought to be either an unknown lady of the 2nd century AD or a 4th century AD of the Emperor Constantine's mother, or possibly an unknown lady of the 4th century AD. But through the 18th and 19th centuries, she was called Agrippina, and she was one of the high spots of the tourist trail in Rome. You'll have guessed what the problem was. It was never quite clear to the visitor which Agrippina she was meant to be. And visitor reactions in their journals vary enormously according to which Agrippina they assumed it was. Either seeing signs of long-suffering virtue in her face as she planned to starve herself to death, or quotes the mild, pathetic, deep despair of a woman who is about to be murdered by her son and ex-lover, the Emperor Nero. People manage brilliantly to see both Agrippinas according to what they expected. Now, touristic ambivalence was, of course, one thing, but it actually became a strongly politicized ambivalence in the early 19th century, when Antonia Canova was commissioned to sculpt a portrait of Napoleon's mother, and the model he chose was Agrippina of the Capitoline. Now, this statue proved to be a controversial statue. Canova's statue was controversial in almost every way. First, because of the fine line there was between creative imitation and sheer plagiarism. Most French critics thought that Canova's work here was really nothing more than a copy of the ancient piece, and his defenders were forced to some rather desperate arguments to show how different Canova's work was from the original, and of course how much better it was. But even more to the point was the question of which Agrippina lay behind it, and so to which of them Letizia Bonaparte was actually being likened. Critics again played fast and loose, but this time largely it seems according to their political alignment for or against the Bonapartes. Was Letizia, Madame Mère, as she was known, was Letizia to be seen, as she no doubt would have wanted, as a new Agrippina the Elder, one who had remained loyal to her dead husband, not marrying again, highly principled? Or was she being satirized as a new Agrippina the Younger, her strained relations with Napoleon giving that a particular piquancy? But the real joke, or the real insult, reflected on the son. For if there was an honourable option for Madame Mère herself here, I am, in the model of Agrippina the Elder, there certainly wasn't one for Napoleon. Because one thing that both these Agrippinas, good and bad, had in common were their truly terrible sons. Agrippina the Elder gave birth to the mad Caligula, and Agrippina the Younger gave birth to the equally mad Nero. There were not a few critics and commentators who felt that that had been Canova's point, and that through the imperial mother, Canova's target was actually Napoleon. But that kind of ambivalence paves the way for where I want to end today, with the more complicated issue of who this couple are in the famous Rubens in the National Gallery, currently labelled Germanicus and Agrippina, implying, as we can now see, the virtuous elder Agrippina in the company of the husband who was killed, it was thought, by the Emperor Tiberius, or at his instigation. Now, it has to be said that for such an apparently simple picture, it raises a lot of very complicated issues. For a start, it is very similar indeed to another painting by Rubens in Chapel Hill, currently goes under the title, rather more discreet, Imperial Couple. And it's not clear which of these Rubens paintings is the first, and so far as I can see, Rubens specialists, which I am not, disagree about their relative merits. Some think the Chapel Hill one is infinitely superior, some think the National Gallery one is. Besides, technical examination of the wood on which the Washington painting is painted suggests that the man was an addition, that it had first been intended to show the woman only. Extra bit of wood is put on. So it's all very complicated. What is clear, however, is that Rubens' inspiration for the treatment of those two heads was in ancient cameos, in which Rubens was a considerable expert and indeed has a collection of his own. And I'm putting on here what seems to be a very nice match, but other people don't think so, of what is known as an Augustus and Livia, was identified in the 16th century as an Augustus and Livia, drawn from a cameo here in a book of illustrations of famous faces, and showing you how like it is, in this case, to the Chapel Hill version. So where's the problem? Well, simply, the problem is that the earliest identification of this painting, that is now in the National Gallery, was not as Germanicus and Agrippina at all, but as Tiberius and Agrippina. And that is how it entered the National Gallery, and that was the title by which it was always known in the collection in Vienna, where it had been since 1710. It was re-identified in the 1960s and then officially renamed. There were various reasons for this. First of all, the face of the man was matched with certain cameos that were believed in the 16th and 17th century to represent Germanicus. Now, I have to say, despite the fact I've just done that myself, I find that kind of matching up always pretty perilous. But it was an attempt to say Rubens got it from this, which is an image of Germanicus. Secondly, and more generally, the pair Tiberius and Agrippina didn't seem to work very well to most people, and some people certainly asked what must have seemed the obvious question, which is, if this is the elder Agrippina, what earth was she doing painted side by side with the Emperor Tiberius, who forced her to suicide? Well, I'm afraid now that I'm going to bring a rabbit out of the hat, because I've not so far confessed that there were not just two Agrippinas, but three. If you look at this family tree, here is the elder Agrippina, the daughter of Julia, and her father, who I previously called just Marcus Agrippa. Here's his full name, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who had previously been married to a woman called Attica and had a child, also female, known as Vipsania Agrippina. So there is another Vipsania Agrippina, who's the half-sister of Vipsania Agrippina. Now, we normally call this Agrippina Vipsania, but we only do that in order, for the obvious reason that it cuts down the potential for confusion, right? Two Agrippinas are quite enough, so we choose to call her Vipsania so we don't get her mixed up. But in antiquity, in the Roman world, right through to the 18th century, she was normally called Agrippina. So there were always three of them. And who was she? Well, she was the first wife of the Emperor Tiberius. As the original Vienna catalogue makes absolutely clear, it's no secret, it said Tiberius and his wife Agrippina. So who is that painting of? It certainly could be Germanicus and Agrippina, as the current identification has it, and that's certainly the more standard pairing. But I want to say that you get a different, but I think quite powerful reading of it if you think, like the earliest catalogue, that is actually Agrippina number 3 with Tiberius here. Let me just explain. Tiberius, as emperor, has not, I have to say, had a generally very good press. right? Morose, hypocritical, vengeful. He was the Emperor Augustus's last choice to succeed him, although it was Livia's natural son. Nasty piece of work. But according to Suetonius, there was one woman he really, really loved, and that was his first wife, Vipsania Agrippina. He loved her absolutely devotedly, and they had a child. But he was forced by his stepfather, the Emperor Augustus, to divorce her, to marry Augustus's own daughter for entirely dynastic reasons, someone he really didn't want to marry at all, and was a bundle of trouble. He had no choice about it. That was the imperial command, but he never got over it. According to Suetonius, after this divorce, when Tiberius was still really in mourning for Vipsania Agrippina, on one occasion he caught sight of her in the street in Rome, and he followed her, weeping, and his mind as ever after took absolute care that he should never, ever catch a glimpse of her again. It seems to me that in this image of two people staring absolutely in parallel, not looking at each other, but held in the same canvas, seems to me there's not much of a better way to capture the relationship between Tiberius and the woman who we now call Vipsania than this. So I'd like to think that you go along and have a look at this picture and try reading it in two ways. Try reading it as Germanicus and Agrippina, and then seeing what happens, like all those ladies who went up to the Capitoline and thought it was the other Agrippina. Find out what happens if you try and see it as Tiberius and his Agrippina, because I think it comes to life in a different way. Thank you very much, and see you in 2 weeks, I hope.